The wind that tore across the Wyoming Territory in November of 1883 did not just blow. It hunted. It sought out the cracks in the chinking of the log walls. It found the gaps in the collar of a heavy wool coat, and it whistled through the empty rib cages of dead cottonwoods down by the creek. Silas Vance stood by the railing of his corral, his gloved hands resting on the rough pine. He was a man whittled down by the land, lean and hard, with a face weathered by sun and wind until it resembled the very leather of his saddle. At 35 years old, he carried the silence of the high plains in his posture. He watched his small herd of cattle huddled together against the biting gusts. They were too thin. Their coats were shaggy and dull, and their breath plumed in the gray air like the smoke from a dying fire. There should have been more of them. There should have been more hay in the barn. There should have been smoke rising from the bunkhouse chimney, signaling that men were inside, warming their hands and waiting for the morning work. But the bunkhouse was dark and cold. The door latch rusted shut. Silas was alone. He adjusted his hat, pulling the brim lower against the stinging grit. The isolation was absolute. To the west, the mountains rose like jagged iron teeth against a sky the color of a bruised plum. To the east, the plains stretched out into an endless, undulating ocean of brown grass and sage. The silence was only broken by the lowing of a cow and the rhythmic creaking of the windmill that fought a losing battle against the gale. He turned and walked toward his cabin. It was a sturdy structure, built by his own hands 5 years ago, when hope had been as abundant as the summer grass. Now, it felt like a fortress under siege. He stepped inside, the sudden quiet of the room ringing in his ears. The air smelled of wood smoke, stale coffee, and solitude. On the table lay a ledger, open to a page filled with numbers written in black ink. Silas did not need to look at them to know what they said. He owed the bank in town $300 by the 1st of January. He owed the feed store $50. He had $17 in a tin coffee can on the mantelpiece. He sat down heavily on the bench, his joints popping. He rubbed his left shoulder, where the old ache flared up whenever the weather turned. It was a souvenir from a chaotic skirmish in Virginia, nearly 20 years ago, when he had been a boy wearing a uniform that did not fit. He had seen men torn apart by grape shot and boys crying for their mothers in the mud. He had come west to forget the noise, to find a place where the only sound was the wind and the work. But a man could not work a ranch this size alone, not and keep it. He needed a partner. He needed hands. He needed money. The wind rattled the door, a reminder that winter was not coming. It was already scratching at the threshold. If he did not find a solution before the deep snows buried the passes, the bank would take the land, and he would be nothing but another driftless drifter, haunted by the ghosts of what he could have built. 2 days later, Silas rode into Ironwood. The town was a collection of false-fronted buildings clinging to the edge of the railroad tracks, huddled together as if for warmth. Mud frozen into ruts shattered under the hooves of his bay gelding. He tied the horse outside the general store and stepped into the warmth. The air inside was thick with the smell of tobacco, sawdust, and damp wool. A group of men stood near the pot-bellied stove, laughing loud and harsh. Silas kept his head down, moving toward the counter to buy a sack of flour and a tin of coffee. He avoided crowds. He avoided eyes, but he could not avoid their voices. "Did you hear about the freak coming in on the stage?" one man asked. He was a thick-necked rancher named Grady, known for a loud mouth and a heavy hand with his horses. "I heard," another man replied, chuckling. "They say she is 7 feet tall if she is an inch. A mountain of a woman. A bride." Grady scoffed. "Who would marry a thing like that? You would need a ladder to kiss her and a whip to tame her." The men roared with laughter. Silas felt a muscle in his jaw jump. He placed his coins on the counter, counting them out carefully. $1.20. The storekeeper, a balding man with kind eyes but a nervous manner, leaned in as he bagged the flour. "Do not mind them. Silas, they have nothing better to do than chew on gossip." Silas nodded once, accepting the sack. "Who is she?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. The storekeeper lowered his voice. A broker from Chicago arranged it. Brought her out on the train to Cheyenne. Then the stage. She is a big woman. Silas. They say she was in a show back east. A curiosity. No family. The broker is looking to marry her off to anyone who will take her. Says she comes with a dowry. $500 and a strong back. Silas froze. $500. It was enough to pay the bank. It was enough to buy feed for the winter. It was enough to hire a hand come spring. But the thought turned his stomach. To marry a woman for money. To take a stranger into his home, into his life, simply because he was desperate. It felt like a betrayal of something holy, though he was not a religious man. He walked out of the store, the wind hitting him like a slap. He stood on the boardwalk, looking at the gray sky. He thought of his empty bunkhouse. He thought of the calves that would die if he could not afford hay. He thought of the land, the only thing he had ever loved that had not left him. He found the broker in a small, rented office at the back of the hotel. The man was thin, wearing a suit that was too shiny and smelling of rose water and sweat. He looked up as Silas filled the doorway. "Mr. Higgins?" Silas asked. The man stood, smiling a smile that did not reach his eyes. "That is me. And you are?" "Silas Vance. I have a ranch north of here." Yes." Higgins gestured to a chair. "You have heard about the arrangement?" "I heard," Silas said, remaining standing. "She is a sturdy woman, Mr. Vance. Very sturdy. Strong as an ox. A bit quiet. Odd, some might say. But she is untouched. I can vouch for that. Pure as the driven snow. Despite her time in the public eye, she is stubborn, though has a fire in her." Silas looked at the man's hands. They were soft, pink hands. Hands that had never dug a post hole or held a dying calf. "And the money?" Silas asked, hating the words as they left his mouth. $500, payable upon the signing of the marriage certificate. And, of course, you get her labor. She can lift more than most men I know." Silas closed his eyes for a second. He saw the ledger on his table. He saw the frozen creek. He saw the years of blood and mud behind him and the emptiness ahead. "I will do it," he said. Higgins beamed, clapping his hands together. "Excellent. A wise decision. Mr. Vance, a very practical decision." He produced a document, the paper crisp and white. Silas took the pen. His hand trembled. It was a slight tremor. A ghost from the war, from the day a bullet had shattered his shoulder and his nerve. But today, it felt like fear. He was signing away his solitude. He was buying a human being. He scrawled his name, Silas John Vance. "It is done," Higgins said, blowing on the ink. "She arrives on the afternoon stage. You can meet her there." Silas walked out of the office, feeling heavier than he ever had in his life. He told himself he was saving the ranch. He told himself he was giving this woman a home, which was surely better than being peddled by a man like Higgins. But the wind whispered otherwise. The stagecoach lurched violently, hitting a rut that sent a jolt of pain up Alara's spine. She sat hunched in the corner of the carriage, her knees pressed tight against her chest because there was nowhere else for them to go. The roof was too low. Her bonnet brushed against the fabric lining with every sway. She was 24 years old, but her eyes held the weariness of an old woman. She closed them, trying to block out the stare of the woman sitting opposite her, a severe matron with a pinched mouth who clutched her handbag as if Alara might snatch it. Alara was used to stares. She had lived her life under them. "Step right up. Come and see the Amazonian wonder, the giantess of the north. See the woman who can crush a horseshoe in one hand." The ringmaster's voice echoed in her memory, shrill and grating. For 6 years, she had been a spectacle. She had stood on a wooden platform, dressed in a ridiculous costume of faux Roman armor. While men paid 5 cents to gawk at her, they would shout crude things. They would ask her to stand up, turn around, show her teeth. They discussed her dimensions as if she were a prize heifer at a county fair. 6 feet, 6 inches, the ringmaster would shout. Over 250 pounds of womanly might. She had learned to turn into stone. She had learned to fix her eyes on a point above their heads and disappear inside herself. But she had made a vow, carved into the bedrock of her soul. No one would touch her. They could look, they could mock, they could throw peanuts, but they would not touch. She had broken the wrist of a drunkard in St. Louis who had tried to grab her ankle. After that, the ringmaster had sold her contract to Higgins. "You are too much trouble, girl," he had said. "Let some rancher deal with you. Now." She was being delivered like a crate of dry goods, a dowry. That was what they called the money Higgins was paying the man to take her off his hands. She was a liability being liquidated. The stagecoach slowed, the driver shouting to the horses. Elara felt a surge of nausea that had nothing to do with the motion. This was it, Ironwood, her new cage. She looked out the window. The town was dismal, a smear of brown against the white dusted plains. People were already gathering. Of course they were. News of the freak traveled faster than the wind. The coach groaned to a halt. The door swung open. "End of the line! Folks!" the driver yelled. Elara waited for the other passengers to exit. She needed the space to unfold herself. When the carriage was empty, she took a deep breath, steeling herself against the inevitable. She ducked her head low, maneuvering her broad shoulders through the narrow frame, and stepped down into the mud. A hush fell over the crowd. She straightened to her full height. She stood 6 feet and 6 inches tall, towering over every man on the boardwalk. She wore a plain gray woolen dress that had been let out at the seams, and a heavy shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She kept her chin high, her face a mask of cold indifference. She heard the whispers. "Look at the size of her. It ain't natural. That's a woman. Thought it was a bear on its hind legs." She stared straight ahead, her hands clenched into fists beneath her shawl. Then she saw him. He stood apart from the crowd, near a hitching post where a bay horse tossed its head. He was not a big man, perhaps 5 feet 10 or 11, but he was built like a whipcord. He wore a faded canvas coat and a black hat pulled low. He was looking at her, but his expression was not one of mockery. He looked stunned. Silas could not breathe. He had expected a monster. The men in the saloon had painted a picture of a grotesque creature, misshapen and coarse. The woman standing by the stagecoach was vast, yes. Her shadow stretched long across the street, but she was not a monster. She was magnificent. Her hair, the color of dark walnut, was pulled back severely, but loose tendrils escaped to frame a face that was strong-boned and pale. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and guarded by a fortress of walls so high he doubted anyone had ever climbed them. She carried herself not with the lumbering gait of a beast, but with a terrifying, silent dignity. She looked like a queen from a storybook who had lost her kingdom and was walking to the gallows. He saw her hands tremble, just once, before she stilled them. It was a tiny movement, invisible to the crowd, but he saw it because he knew what it was to shake with fear while standing still. He pushed off the post and walked toward her. The crowd parted. Sensing the moment, he stopped 3 feet away from her, forced to tilt his head back to look her in the eye. "Mrs. Vance?" he asked. His voice was quiet, barely carrying over the wind. She looked down at him. Her eyes assessed him, searching for the cruelty she expected. "I am Elara," she said. Her voice was surprisingly low, a rich alto that vibrated in the air. "I am Silas," he said. He took off his hat, the wind ruffling his brown hair. "The wagon is this way." He did not offer his arm. He sensed that she would not want to be touched. He simply turned and began to walk toward the wagon he had loaded with supplies. After a heartbeat, he heard the heavy, deliberate crunch of her boots following him. The ride to the ranch was a torture of silence. Elara sat on the bench seat beside him, her thigh pressing against the wooden side of the wagon to keep distance between them. The wagon was old and rattled violently over the frozen ruts. The sky began to darken, the gray deepening to a charcoal black. The temperature plummeted. "Are you cold?" Silas asked, looking straight ahead at the ears of the horses. "I am fine," she said. It was a lie. Her coat was too thin for this territory. "There is a blanket behind the seat," he said. "I said I am fine," she repeated, sharper this time. She would not accept charity. She would not show weakness. Silas nodded and said nothing more. Coyotes began to sing from the ridges, their yips and howls echoing like demented laughter. Elara flinched at the sound. "Just coyotes," Silas said softly. "They will not come close." She gripped her shawl tighter. It was not the animals she feared. It was the man beside her. He had not mocked her yet, but the night was young. She wondered what he expected for his $500. She wondered if she would have to fight him. She looked at his profile, the sharp nose, the stubble on his jaw, the tired lines around his eyes. He looked like a man who had forgotten how to smile. They arrived at the ranch in pitch darkness. The cabin was a small shadow against the vastness of the night. Silas halted the horses and jumped down. "Wait here," he said. He helped her down, though she ignored his outstretched hand and hopped down herself, the ground shaking slightly under her impact. He led her to the door and pushed it open. The cabin was warm, the embers in the stove still glowing. Silas lit a kerosene lantern, the golden light washing over the room. It was one room, a single, large room. Elara's eyes darted around. A cast-iron stove, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, a wash basin, and in the corner, a bed, a proper bed with a quilt. In the far corner, near the door, was a pile of ropes and a thin mattress ticking. "Put your things anywhere," Silas said, closing the door against the wind. The silence rushed back in, suffocating. He gestured to the bed in the corner. "That is yours." Elara looked at him, confused. "And you?" "I will take the rope bed," he said. "I am used to rough sleeping." He moved to the stove, adding wood, his back to her. She watched him, wary. Was this a trick, a game to make her lower her guard? She took off her shawl and folded it precisely, placing it on the foot of the bed. She kept her coat on. She felt massive in this space. If she stretched out her arms, she felt she could touch both walls. She hunched her shoulders, trying to pull her rib cage in, trying to occupy less air. "I made a stew before I left," Silas said. "It should still be good." He ladled thick beef and potato stew into 2 tin bowls and set them on the table. He cut 2 hunks of bread. "Sit, please," he said. She sat. The chair creaked ominously under her weight. She flushed, waiting for the joke, waiting for him to say, "Careful, big girl. Do not break my furniture." Silas did not blink. He sat opposite her, bowed his head for a brief second, whether in prayer or exhaustion. She could not tell, and began to eat. They ate in silence. The only sounds were the scraping of spoons and the howling of the wind outside, which sounded like it was trying to claw the roof off. Elara ate quickly, her eyes fixed on her bowl. She was starving, but she was ashamed of her hunger, just as she was ashamed of her size. When the meal was done, Silas stood and gathered the bowls. "I will wash," he said. "You have had a long journey." Elara stood up. "I can work," she said. That was the deal. Silas paused, his hands in the soapy water. "Tomorrow," he said without turning. "Tomorrow there will be plenty of work. Rest now." She retreated to the corner. She turned her back to him to unbutton her dress, her fingers fumbling with the tiny buttons. She kept her undergarments on, a heavy shift and bloomers. She slid under the quilt, pulling it up to her chin. The bed was too short. Her feet hung off the end, exposing her ankles to the cold air. She curled her legs up, making herself a ball. Silas finished the dishes. He blew out the lantern, plunging the room into darkness save for the orange glow from the stove vents. She heard the rustle of his clothes as he undressed, the creak of the rope bed as he lay down. "Good night." "Elara," he said from the dark. She did not answer. She lay staring into the blackness, listening to the wind scream. She thought of the show. She thought of the cage wagon she used to travel in. This cabin was larger, yes, but it was still a cage, and she was still the animal inside it. She had traded the ringmaster for this silent, broken cowboy. She wondered when he would demand his money's worth. She wondered if she would have the strength to stop him. Across the room, Silas stared up at the invisible rafters. He could hear her breathing, slow, terrified breaths. He felt a crushing weight in his chest. He had done it. He had saved the land. But at what cost? He had brought a stranger into his sanctuary. He had bought a wife. He felt like the kind of man he used to despise, a man who used others for his own survival. He closed his eyes, but sleep did not come. Outside, the snow began to fall, burying the world in white, sealing them in together. The dawn broke not with light, but with a gradual graying of the dark, revealing a world locked in iron. The temperature had plunged overnight, sealing the Wyoming territory in a frost so deep it felt like the air itself might shatter if one moved too quickly. Silas Vance pushed open the cabin door, the hinges screaming in protest against the cold. He stepped out onto the porch, his breath billowing like steam from a locomotive. He pulled his collar up, squinting against the glare of the rising sun reflecting off the crusted snow. The mountains in the distance were no longer purple shadows, but sharp, blue teeth biting into the pale sky. Elara followed him a moment later. She wore a man's heavy coat he had found in an old trunk, the sleeves barely reaching her wrists, and a wool scarf wrapped high around her neck. She did not shiver. She stood beside him, her head nearly brushing the roof beams of the porch, and looked out at the desolation. "We need to break the ice on the trough," Silas said, his voice rough with sleep. Elara nodded. "I will get the axe." They moved toward the barn in a silence that had become their third companion. It had been 2 weeks since she arrived, and the routine was already etched into their bones. Work was the language they spoke best. Silas watched her as she walked ahead of him. Her boots crunched heavily through the snow crust. He had expected a burden. He had expected to spend his winter nursing a frightened city woman who would weep at the howling wind or faint at the sight of blood. He had been wrong. At the water trough, a solid 3 inches of ice had formed. Silas reached for the axe, but Elara was already there. She lifted the heavy tool with one hand, the muscles in her arms shifting beneath the thick wool of her coat, and brought it down. The sound was like a gunshot, a sharp crack that echoed off the barn walls. She struck again and again, with a rhythmic, terrifying power. Water surged up through the fractures, dark and freezing. She stepped back, resting the axe on her shoulder as if it weighed no more than a broom. "Done," she said. Silas stared at the shattered ice. He had struggled with that same chore yesterday, his bad shoulder aching with every swing. "Thank you," he said quietly. She did not look at him. She turned toward the hayloft. "The cattle are hungry." They worked through the morning, a seamless machine of necessity. The cattle were thin, their ribs showing through their winter coats like the rungs of a ladder. Silas pitched hay from the loft, pain radiating down his left arm, while Elara carried the grain sacks. These were 100-pound sacks of feed, heavy dead weights that made most men grunt and strain. Silas usually dragged them. Elara bent her knees, gripped the burlap, and hoisted a sack onto her shoulder in one fluid motion. She walked to the troughs, her stride steady, and poured the grain without a tremor in her hands. Silas paused, leaning on his pitchfork, watching her. It was not just strength, it was efficiency. She did not waste energy. She moved with the economy of someone who had spent a lifetime doing physical labor, but it was later, when they were checking the horses, that he saw something else. His bay gelding, distinctively skittish in the cold, was tossing his head, eyes rolling white. Silas reached for the halter, but the horse jerked away, snapping his teeth. "Easy," Silas warned. Elara moved past him. She did not shrink away. She stepped into the stall, her massive frame filling the space. The horse froze, ears flickering. Elara did not grab the animal. She simply laid her large hand on the horse's neck, just behind the ear. She began to hum. It was a low, thrumming sound, more vibration than melody. She stroked the coarse hair, her touch impossibly light for a hand that could crush bone. "You are just cold," she murmured to the beast. "You are just cold and tired of the wind. I know, I know." The horse lowered his head, blowing out a long breath, and leaned his weight against her chest. She stood there, a giantess in a man's coat, absorbing the animal's fear. Silas stood in the aisle, forgotten. He felt a strange tightness in his throat. He had seen men break horses with whips and spurs. He had never seen a woman calm one by simply being solid. "You have a way with them," Silas said, his voice breaking the spell. Alara stiffened. She pulled her hand away and stepped back, her shoulders curling inward as if she had been caught doing something forbidden. "I grew up around animals," she said defensively, moving toward the door. "In the show, the elephants liked me." Silas followed her out into the blinding daylight. "It is more than that," he said. "You work harder than any hand I have ever hired, and you are gentler than any of them, too." Alara stopped. She looked down at him, her dark eyes wide with shock. She waited for the punchline. She waited for him to add, "For a freak," but he only adjusted his hat and pointed to the fence line. "That north section needs mending before the next snow." She watched him walk away. A warmth that had nothing to do with the sun bloomed in her chest. She crushed it down instantly. Hope was dangerous. Compliments were usually the bait for a trap. But as she picked up the coil of wire, she replayed his words in her mind, hoarding them like gold coins. The boundaries in the cabin were as tangible as the log walls. They lived in a space no larger than 20 feet by 20 feet, yet they maintained a distance of miles. Silas had rigged a blanket on a rope to partition off the corner where her bed stood. When she needed to change or wash, she would say, "Turn," and he would go outside or busy himself at the stove with his back fully turned. He never entered her space, not once. She slept in the bed with the quilt. He slept on the rope mattress in the corner, wrapped in rough wool. At night, the darkness was filled with the sounds of their separate existences, the rustle of straw, the shift of a body, the slow rhythm of breathing. They did not touch. When they passed tools to each other, they were careful to grip opposite ends. When they sat at the small table to eat, they kept their elbows tucked in. Both of them were acutely aware of the physics of their bodies. Alara felt her size like a sin. She tried to make herself small, hunching her spine, keeping her legs tucked under the chair. Silas felt his gaze like a weapon. He caught himself watching her, the curve of her neck, the power in her wrists, and would force his eyes to the floor, consumed by guilt, but slowly. The silence between them began to change texture. It shifted from the tense silence of strangers to the companionable silence of survivors. Small rituals formed like ice crystals on a window pane. At dawn, before the work began, Silas would brew coffee strong enough to strip paint. He would pour 2 tin cups and set hers on the table. They would stand there, drinking the scalding liquid, watching the gray light seep through the cracks in the shutters. "Ready?" he would ask. "Ready," she would answer. It was the only vow they had actually made to each other. In the evenings, if the wind died down, they would sit on the porch bench. The sunset over the mountains was a violent bruising of purple and crimson. They did not speak of the beauty. They just witnessed it. Alara would sit with her hands folded in her lap, massive and still. Silas would smoke a pipe, the smoke drifting up to mingle with the cold air. During the snow squalls that swept down from the peaks, they would take shelter against the leeward wall of the stable, standing shoulder to shoulder, not touching, but close enough to block the wind for one another. It was in these quiet moments that the ghosts began to show themselves. One afternoon, the crack of a rifle echoed from the ridge, a hunter tracking elk miles away. Silas was repairing a bridle. At the sound, he dropped the leather. His body went rigid, his eyes blowing wide and vacant. He was back in Virginia. He was back in the smoke. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, and his hand flew to the old wound on his shoulder. Alara saw it. She was holding the lantern. She did not speak. She did not touch him. She simply moved her large body between him and the door, blocking the view of the ridge, creating a wall of safety. "It is just a hunter. Silas," she said, her voice dropping to that low hum she used for the horses. "Just a hunter. We are here. We are safe." He blinked, the terror slowly draining from his face. replaced by a gray shame. He looked at her, seeing her solidity. "I know," he whispered. "I know." Days later, it was her turn. They were in the barn when the wind carried the sound of men laughing from the road, travelers passing by, shouting a joke to one another. Elara flinched as if she had been struck. She dropped the curry brush she was holding. She backed into the corner of the stall, her arms crossing over her chest, her eyes darting frantically to the door. Her breathing turned shallow and fast. She made herself small, terrified, expecting the door to burst open, expecting the pointing fingers and the jeers. Silas stepped to the barn door and looked out. He saw the riders disappearing over the hill. He turned back to her. "They are gone," he said firmly. "They were not looking at us." Elara stared at him, her chest heaving. She looked like a trapped animal. Silas realized then that her scars were not on her skin. He realized that laughter was to her what gunfire was to him. "We are a fine pair," he thought bitterly. "Two broken things trying to build a whole. We are out of flour," Elara said one evening, scraping the bottom of the barrel. "And coffee." Silas looked up from the ledger. He had been dreading this. A trip to town was unavoidable. "I will go tomorrow," he said. "I will come with you," she said. Silas hesitated. "Elara, it might be better if I go alone. The snow is deep, and people will stare." She finished for him. She turned to face him, drawing herself up to her full height. Her chin was set in a line of granite. "I am your wife, Silas, at least on paper. I will not hide here like a shame you keep in the cellar. Besides, you cannot load the supplies alone with your bad shoulder." He looked at her. She was right about the shoulder. It had been throbbing for days. But more than that, he saw the pride in her eyes. To leave her behind would be to agree with the town that she was something to be hidden. "We leave at first light," he said. The ride to Ironwood was tense. The wagon wheels crunched loudly on the frozen road. Elara wore her best dress, a dark blue wool that was frayed at the cuffs, and her heavy coat. She sat straight, her eyes fixed on the horizon, preparing for battle. When they rolled onto the main street, the town seemed to pause. A blacksmith stopped his hammer. A woman shaking a rug on a balcony froze. Heads turned, fingers pointed. Silas kept his eyes forward, snapping the reins. He pulled the wagon up to the general store and set the brake. "Stay close," he murmured. They walked into the store. The bell above the door chimed cheerfully, a stark contrast to the sudden silence that fell over the room. 3 men were leaning against the counter. One of them was Harlan Boyd. Harlan was a wealthy man by local standards, owning the largest herd in the valley. He was big, broad in the gut and heavy in the face, and he wore a fur-lined coat that smelled of money and arrogance. He had always looked down on Silas as a failure, a man who couldn't hold his own. "Well, look at this," Harlan said, his voice booming. "Silas Vance has come down from his hill, and he brought his livestock." The other men snickered. Silas felt his blood turn cold. He moved to the counter, placing his order with the nervous clerk. Elara stood by the door, trying to look at the shelves of canned peaches. She felt Harlan's eyes crawling over her back. "Heard you got yourself a bargain, Vance," Harlan continued, stepping away from the counter and circling toward Elara. He walked around her as if inspecting a prize mare. "Bought her by the pound." "Did you?" Silas turned slowly. "Leave it be." Harlan ignored him. He stopped in front of Elara, looking her up and down with a sneer of exaggerated wonder. "Jesus, you are a big one, aren't you? Look at those shoulders. You could pull a plow better than a mule." Elara stared at a spot on the wall, her face burning. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. "Tell me, girl," Harlan said, leaning in close. His breath smelled of whiskey and onions. "Is it true what they say? That you was in a circus? Did they make you dance, or did you just stand there and let folks throw peanuts?" Elara did not answer. She was trembling, a fine vibration that ran through her massive frame. "I asked you a question. Freak." Harlan spat. Silas moved. It was not a sudden lunge, but a fluid, dark motion. He stepped between Elara and Harlan, his back to her. He stood 6 inches shorter than the bully, but in that moment, He looked like death itself. His hand hung loose by his side, inches from the worn walnut grip of his revolver. "Step away," Silas said. His voice was not loud. It was a whisper, scraping like gravel on glass. Harlan laughed, but he took a half-step back. "Or what? Vance, you going to shoot me over this?" He gestured to Alara. "You bought a circus act. Silas, you can't expect us not to enjoy the show. Tell me, is she for rent? Like the horses? I got some fencing needs doing." The air in the store vanished. The clerk ducked behind the counter. Silas's eyes were black voids. "Do not speak of her again. Do not look at her. If you come near my land, or near my wife, I will put you in the ground." Harlan's face reddened. He bristled, his hand twitching toward his own gun belt. "You threatening me, pauper? The town doesn't need freaks, and it doesn't need failed soldiers protecting them." The tension pulled tight, a wire about to snap. Silas's fingers curled. He was ready. He could feel the old rhythm, the slide of metal, the explosion. "That is enough." The sheriff stood in the doorway. A double-barreled shotgun cracked open over his arm. He was an older man, tired of the winter and tired of Harlan Boyd. "Break it up," the sheriff ordered. "Harlan, get your business done and get out. Silas, take your wife and go home." Harlan sneered, spitting on the floorboards near Silas's boot. "This isn't over. Vance, you think you can bring a monster into this valley and we will just smile? Trouble is coming." He pushed past them, shouldering Alara as he went. She stumbled back a step, catching herself on a barrel of apples. Silas did not look at the sheriff. He took Alara's elbow, his hand small against her arm, and guided her out. "Let's go." The ride back was excruciating. The silence was not companionable now. It was jagged. Alara sat hunched over, staring at her knees. The humiliation burned in her chest, hot and suffocating. Back at the cabin, she moved with jerky, brittle motions. She slammed the flour sack onto the table. She began to unbutton her coat, her fingers fumbling. "Alara," Silas said gently. He reached out to touch her shoulder. "Do not," she snapped, pulling away. She backed into the corner, her eyes wet and furious. "Do not pity me, Silas. I do not pity you," he said. "He was a bastard. He is a fool." "He spoke the truth," she cried, her voice rising, cracking with the weight of the day. "I am a freak. Look at me. I am a monster that you bought to pull your plow. Do not pretend it is anything else." She turned her face to the wall, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "I am used to it," she whispered harshly. "I am used to the laughter. But do not try to be kind. It makes it worse. This is what I am." Silas stood in the center of the room, helpless. He wanted to tell her she was beautiful. He wanted to tell her that when he stood between her and Harlan, he wasn't protecting property. He was protecting his only reason to wake up in the morning. But the words stuck in his throat, blocked by his own shame. He had bought her. He had signed the paper. He retreated to the stove, his heart aching. Night fell, heavy and starless. The wind picked up again, rattling the shutters. They ate a cold supper without speaking. Silas lit the lantern and set it on the table. The golden light carved a small circle of warmth in the gloom. "Alara," he said softly. She was sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at her hands. They were large, capable hands, scarred from work. "Tell me," he said. "Tell me about before." She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. "Why?" "Because I want to know you, not what Harlan sees, not what the paper says. You—" She hesitated. The fire popped in the stove. "My mother died when I was born," she began, her voice a hollow monotone. "My father, he was a small man. He did not know what to do with a daughter who grew so fast. By the time I was 12, I was taller than him. He sold me to the show when I was 14. Silas felt a sick twist in his gut. 14, the ringmaster. He had a stick, she said, looking past Silas into the shadows. He taught me to walk heavy, to look fierce. He measured me every week. He would shout the numbers to the crowd. Look at the circumference of her wrist. Look at the span of her hand. She wrapped her arms around herself. They paid extra to come into the tent, to touch my arm, to measure me against themselves. They would laugh. Always the laughter. Some men wanted to see if I was big everywhere. They would offer money to the ringmaster to come into my wagon. Silas gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. Did he? No, she said quickly. I was too strong. I threw one man through the canvas wall. After that, the ringmaster sold me to Higgins. He said I was too much trouble if I wouldn't be useful. She looked at Silas then, her gaze piercing. I have never been touched. Silas, not by a man who wanted to hold me, only by men who wanted to weigh me or break me. I do not know what it is to be desired. The thought of it terrifies me, because I think if someone touched me, they would only feel a monster. Silas closed his eyes. The shame washed over him, hot and bitter. He had taken part in this. He had paid Higgins. He was the next link in the chain of men who had traded her. I am sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry. Elara, she didn't answer, but in the days that followed, the air in the cabin shifted again. The raw honesty had cracked the walls between them. Desire began to seep in, subtle as groundwater. One morning, Silas was shaving by the wash basin. He had his shirt off, the scars on his shoulders silvery in the light. Elara was kneading dough at the table. She looked up and watched the razor glide over his throat. Her eyes lingered on the line of his jaw, the vulnerability of his exposed neck. When he rinsed the blade and turned, she looked down quickly, her face flushed. Another evening. Elara was sitting by the fire, braiding her long, dark hair. She swept the heavy mass over one shoulder, exposing the nape of her neck, pale and soft. Silas, mending a harness, found his hands stilling. He traced the curve of her neck with his eyes, imagining the weight of her hair, the warmth of her skin. He felt a sudden, sharp hunger that had nothing to do with food. He forced himself to look away, his heart hammering against his ribs. They were dancing on the edge of a cliff. The part ended on a Tuesday night. The wind had died, leaving a silence so profound it rang in the ears. They were standing by the stove. Elara had just poured the last of the coffee into his cup. As she pulled her hand back, her fingers brushed against his. It was a mistake, a clumsy accident of space, but neither of them pulled away. Her hand, large, calloused, warm, rested against his knuckles. Silas stopped breathing. The contact sent a shock through him that was almost painful. He looked at her hand, then up to her face. Elara was staring at him, her lips slightly parted, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. She did not retreat. She did not hunch her shoulders. She stood tall, her hand lingering on his for 10 seconds. The world narrowed down to the point where their skin touched. The heat of the stove was nothing compared to the heat rising between them. Then, a log shifted in the firebox. A loud pop shattered the silence. Elara gasped and jerked her hand back as if burned. She turned away, grabbing a dish rag, scrubbing a spot on the table that was already clean. Silas stood there, his hand still tingling, staring at her back. He said nothing, but as he looked at her, he knew that he was no longer just a lonely man trying to save a ranch. He was a man falling in love with a giantess, and he was terrified that he would break her, or that she would break him. February arrived with a deceitful smile. The sun broke through the iron clouds for 3 days, melting the top layer of snow into a slurry of mud and hope, only to vanish behind a fresh wall of white. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in an hour. The wind returned, screaming down from the bighorns with renewed malice, freezing the slush into jagged ruts that could break a horse's leg. On the Vance Ranch, the false spring brought death. The blizzard that followed was not the heavy, silent burying kind. It was a scouring. It drove ice crystals horizontally like birdshot. When the white curtain finally lifted, Silas found 6 of his heifers piled in a draw, frozen solid. They were huddled together, coated in rime, looking like statues carved from quartz. Silas stood over them, his scarf wrapped around his face, his gloved hands tucked into his armpits. He did not curse. He did not yell. He simply did the arithmetic in his head. 6 heifers. That was next year's breeding stock. That was the profit margin he needed to buy seed for the hay. The silence of the dead cattle was louder than the wind. He rode back to the cabin. His posture slumped. When he entered, Elara was at the stove, stirring a pot of beans. She looked at him, her dark eyes reading the set of his shoulders. "How many?" she asked. "6," Silas said. He sat at the table and pulled off his gloves. His fingers were white and waxy. Elara poured him a cup of coffee and set it down without a word. She knew better than to offer false comfort. The next day, a rider struggled up the track, a courier from the bank in Cheyenne, his horse steaming in the cold. He handed Silas a packet of letters, accepted a cup of hot coffee, and left as quickly as he could to beat the sun down. Silas sat by the window, the gray light falling on the paper. One envelope stood out. It was heavy, cream-colored paper, smelling faintly of the city. The return address was Higgins Associates, Chicago. Silas broke the seal. As he read, his face went ashen. "Dear Mr. Vance, due to unforeseen market adjustments and the rising costs of transportation, the initial dowry agreement has been reviewed. The remaining balance of the arrangement fee, $200, is due immediately. Furthermore, I have received inquiries from a traveling exhibition in San Francisco regarding the acquisition of unique specimens. Should you be unable to fulfill the financial terms of our contract, I reserve the right to reclaim the collateral involved in the transaction. Sincerely, A. Higgins, Collateral." Silas crushed the letter in his fist. His heart hammered against his ribs. $200. He did not have 20, and the threat was clear. Higgins was not just asking for money. He was threatening to take Elara back, to sell her to a sideshow in California. Silas looked up. Elara was across the room, mending a tear in his spare shirt. She had paused, her needle hovering. She had heard the crinkle of the paper. She had seen his hand tremble. "Bad news?" she asked, her voice tight. Silas shoved the letter into his pocket. "Just bank business," he said. "Nothing for you to worry about." Elara's eyes narrowed. She had ears sharp enough to hear a coyote on the ridge. She could hear the lie in his voice. "You look pale. Silas, is it the loan?" "I said it is handled," he snapped. He stood up abruptly, grabbing his coat. "I have to check the barn." He walked out, leaving her sitting in the silence. Elara put down the shirt. Her hands were shaking. She knew that look. She had seen it on the ringmaster's face when ticket sales were down. It was the look of a man calculating the worth of his assets. The fear, cold and familiar, coiled in her stomach. "He regrets it," she whispered to the empty room. "The cattle are dead. The money is gone. He is looking for a way out." The poison spread from the town outward. Harlan Boyd was not a man to let a grudge die of natural causes. He fed it. He watered it with whiskey and malice in the warm belly of the saloon. Silas had gone into town alone 3 days after the letter arrived, desperate to negotiate an extension on his feed bill. He walked with his head down, but the silence that followed him was heavy. When he left the feed store, he saw a group of men gathered on the porch of the hotel. Harlan was in the center, holding court. "There he goes," Harlan said loudly. "The lion tamer." The men laughed. Silas kept walking, his jaw set. "Hey, Vance," Harlan shouted. "Is it true what they say, that she sleeps in the barn with the horses because she can't fit in the bed?" Silas stopped. He gripped the reins of his horse until his knuckles turned white. "I heard she broke a man's back in St. Louis." Another man called out, "Just snapped him like a twig." "You better watch yourself when she gets angry, Vance, and you better watch your back, folks," Harlan added, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. "We all know Silas here has a twitchy finger. Ask the folks in Dodge about the innocent girl who caught a stray bullet because Vance couldn't aim." Silas froze. The blood drained from his face. It was a lie, mostly. It hadn't been Dodge, and he hadn't fired the shot that killed the bystander, but he had been there. He had been part of the violence. The guilt was the shadow he dragged everywhere. He mounted his horse, refusing to look at them, and rode out of town. But the laughter followed him, sticking to his skin like burrs. The stories reached the ranch before he did. not by word of mouth, but by the change in the air. When he arrived, Ilara was waiting on the porch. She looked brittle, her face pale. A peddler came by while you were gone. She said, "He didn't want to come to the door. He left the thread I ordered by the gate. He looked at me like I was a rabid dog." Silas dismounted. "He is just a fool. Ilara, he asked me if I really killed a man in the circus," she said. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "He said the town is saying I am dangerous, that I hurt people. It is just talk," Silas said, brushing past her. "Harlan Boyd has a big mouth." "But why?" she demanded, following him inside. "Why do they hate us? What did we do?" "We exist," Silas said wearily. That night, the tension in the cabin was thick enough to choke on. Silas paced the floor, the letter in his pocket burning a hole in his coat. He needed money. If he didn't pay Higgins, the man would send someone. A sheriff, a bounty hunter. He would come with a piece of paper claiming Ilara was property. He couldn't tell her. How could he tell her that she was still owned? That her freedom was tied to a debt he couldn't pay? He thought he was protecting her, shielding her from the reality of her precarious position. But to Ilara, his silence looked like calculation. The escalation came 2 nights later. They were eating supper, a silent, grim affair of cornbread and salted pork, when the dog started barking, not the warning bark of a visitor, but the frantic, snarling bark of a threat. Silas was out of his chair instantly, grabbing the Winchester from the wall. "Stay here," he ordered. "I am coming with you," Ilara said, grabbing the lantern. "I said stay here." She ignored him. She followed him out onto the porch. The night was pitch black, moonless. The wind whipped the lantern flame. There was no one there. The hoofbeats of galloping horses were already fading down the road. Silas walked to the gate. He stopped, the lantern light spilling onto the wooden posts. Nailed to the pine were 3 dead jackrabbits, their bodies stiff and bloody, hanging by their ears. Beside them, crudely painted in red axle grease on the wood, were words: "Monster, coward, get out." Silas stared at the rabbits. The violence of it was visceral. It was a promise. Ilara made a sound, a small, strangled gasp. Silas turned. She was staring at the word monster. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, rocking slightly on her feet. "Take it down," she whispered. "Take it down." Silas ripped the rabbits from the post, throwing them into the darkness. He tried to scrub the grease away with his glove, but it smeared, looking like fresh blood. "Go inside, Ilara," he said, his voice shaking with rage. She turned and ran back to the cabin. When Silas came back inside, he barred the door. He turned to face her. She was standing by the table, her face streaked with tears, her body trembling so hard the floorboards vibrated. "Why didn't you shoot them?" she screamed. "They were gone before I got there." Silas said. "You let them do this!" she cried. "You let them paint that name on our home! I cannot stop the wind, Ilara, and I cannot stop men like Harlan from being vicious. You are hiding things," she accused, stepping toward him. She towered over him, her grief making her look formidable. "You hide the letters. You hide the bills. You hide your past. Harlan shouted things in town about a killing, about you killing a girl. Is it true?" Silas flinched. "It was an accident," he said through gritted teeth. "Years ago. I never meant for it to happen. But you never told me. Just like you never told me we are broke. Just like you never told me that broker is writing to you. I am trying to handle it," Silas yelled, his controls snapping. "I am trying to keep this ranch afloat. I am trying to keep a roof over your head. I don't need a roof. I need the truth. Are you sending me away? Is that what the letter said? Are you selling me back?" "No!" Silas shouted. "I am trying to pay him so he doesn't come for you." "Pay him?" Ilara froze. "Pay him what?" Silas raked a hand through his hair, pacing frantically. "Higgins wants more money. He says the contract has changed. He called you. He stopped." The room went dead silent. "He called me what?" Ilara asked. Her voice was very quiet. Silas looked at her. He saw the trap he had walked into. He saw the hurt in her eyes, deep and old. "He called you merchandise," Silas whispered. "He said if I don't pay another $200, he will reclaim the collateral." Elara stood still. She looked as if he had struck her across the face with a whip. "Merchandise," she repeated. "It is just words. Elara, lawyer words. No," she said, "it is what I am. To him and to you. That is not true." Silas stepped forward, reaching for her hand. She snatched it away. "Don't," she hissed. "You bought me. Silas, you paid $500. Now you have to pay $200 more. I'm just a bad investment. A piece of farm equipment that eats too much and brings trouble." "Elara, stop. I bet you wish you could return me," she said, her voice breaking. "I bet you look at that letter and wish you had never signed that paper. You are ashamed of me. You hide me away. You don't touch me. You don't even look at me when you think I can see." "I look at you," Silas cried. "I look at you every day. You look at a freak," she screamed. The word hung in the air. Silas stared at her, breathing hard. He saw the walls she had built slamming back into place. He saw the lonely, terrified girl hiding inside the giant body. "I look at my wife," he said softly. But she was gone. She turned her back on him, walking to the dark corner of the room. She sat on her bed, pulling her knees up, turning her face to the wall. "Leave me alone," she said. "Just leave me alone." Silas stood there, his heart bleeding. He wanted to go to her. He wanted to explain that he didn't touch her because he was afraid of terrifying her. Not because she was a freak, but the distance between them felt uncrossable. He sat down at the table and put his head in his hands. He must have dozed off, exhausted by the adrenaline and the grief. He woke to a sound that was not the wind. It was a crackling, like paper being crumpled, but louder. And the smell. Wood smoke. Not the pleasant smell of the stove, but the acrid, choking stench of burning pitch. Silas jerked his head up. The window facing the barn was glowing orange. "Fire!" He scrambled up, knocking the chair over. "Elara, the barn!" Elara was already moving. She was out of bed, her boots in her hand. She shoved her feet into them without lacing them and grabbed her coat. They burst out of the cabin into a nightmare. The barn was blazing. The dry hay in the loft had caught like tinder. Flames were licking up the side of the wall, reaching for the roof. The wind was fanning it, turning the structure into a furnace. Inside, the horses were screaming, high, shrill sounds of pure terror. "Get the buckets!" Silas yelled, running toward the well. "No!" Elara shouted. "There is no time for water. Get the animals!" She ran straight at the burning building. "Elara!" Silas screamed, dropping the bucket. She didn't stop. She threw her shoulder against the barn doors. They were barred from the outside. Someone had jammed a piece of wood into the latch. Arson. It was undeniable. Elara roared, a sound of pure physical effort, and slammed her body against the wood. The bar splintered. The doors flew open. Smoke billowed out, thick and black. Silas ran in after her, wrapping his scarf around his face. The heat was a physical blow. "Get the horses!" Silas yelled. Elara was already there. The bay gelding was rearing, kicking the stall door, eyes wild. Elara didn't flinch. She grabbed the halter, her strength immense. She forced the animal's head down, shouting over the roar of the fire. "Go! Move!" She dragged the horse out into the snow, smacking its rump to send it running toward the pasture. She turned back instantly. The roof groaned. A beam, eaten by fire, was sagging. "The milk cow!" Silas shouted. He was struggling with the gate of the cow pen. The metal was hot. Elara was beside him in a second. She ripped the gate off its hinges. She grabbed the terrified cow by the horns and the neck, literally shoving the animal toward the door. "Get out! Silas!" she yelled. "The roof! I have to get the saddle. My rifle is in the tack room. Leave it!" Silas didn't listen. He ran toward the tack room at the back. He grabbed his saddle, heavy with expensive leather. As he turned, a burning rafter, thick as a man's waist, sheared off from the ceiling. "Silas!" Elara lunged. She couldn't reach him in time to stop the beam, but she reached him in time to shove him. She hit him with her shoulder. knocking him sideways just as the timber crashed down. It missed his skull by inches, but the end of the beam clipped his head and landed across his legs. Sparks showered over him. The heat seared his hands as he tried to push the burning wood away. "Ah!" he screamed. Ilara was there. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the burning beam with her gloved hands. The leather smoked. She gritted her teeth, the veins in her neck bulging. With a primal heave, she lifted the timber off him and threw it aside. She grabbed Silas by the back of his coat and hauled him up as if he were a child. She half-carried, half-dragged him toward the door. They fell out into the snow just as the rest of the roof collapsed. A geyser of sparks shot up into the black sky, illuminating the devastation. They scrambled away on hands and knees, coughing violently. The heat was still intense, singing their eyebrows. They collapsed in a snowbank 20 yards away, watching the structure burn. The barn was gone. The winter feed was gone. The tools were gone. But the horses were huddling by the corral fence. Shivering, the cow was safe. Silas lay on his back, gasping for air. His head was spinning, blood trickling into his eye. His hands burned. Ilara sat up, wiping soot from her face. She looked at him, her eyes wide and white in her blackened face. "Are you alive?" she croaked. Silas nodded. "Thanks to you." The walk back to the cabin was a limping march of the defeated. Inside, the air felt impossibly cold after the inferno. Ilara lit the lantern. Her hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. "Sit," she commanded. Silas sat on the edge of the bed. He was shivering violently, shock setting in. Ilara moved efficiently. She brought a basin of water and a clean cloth. She knelt between his knees. "Let me see your hands," she said. Silas held them out. The palms were red and blistered, angry burns striping the skin. Ilara hissed through her teeth. She took a jar of salve from the shelf, bear grease and herbs, and began to apply it. Her touch was agonizingly gentle. Her large fingers, still stained with soot, moved over his damaged skin with a delicacy that made his breath catch. He looked down at her. Her hair had come loose from its braid, falling in a curtain around her face. She smelled of smoke, sweat, and horsehair. It was the most honest smell he had ever known. He watched her face as she worked. Her brow was furrowed in concentration. She was biting her lip. A smudge of ash darkened her cheekbone. "Ilara," he whispered. She looked up. Their faces were inches apart. "You saved my life," he said again. She looked down at his hands. "You are a fool," she murmured. "Going back for a saddle?" "It wasn't the saddle," he said. "It was the rifle. It was my father's. You are worth more than a gun." "Silas," she said fiercely. The words hung between them. She froze, realizing what she had said. Silas leaned forward. The pain in his hands was forgotten. All he could feel was the magnetic pull of her presence. The heat of the fire still hummed in his blood. The nearness of death had stripped away the pretense. He wanted her, not as a nurse, not as a worker, but as a woman. Ilara saw it in his eyes. She saw the hunger. For a second, her own desire flared, a desperate, aching need to be held, to be comforted after the terror of the night. Her hand lingered on his wrist. Her breathing hitched. But then the memory of the letter crashed back in. Merchandise, collateral. She pulled her hands away abruptly. "I will bandage these," she said, her voice trembling. "Then you need to sleep." "Ilara," Silas said, reaching for her with his bandaged hand. "Please, we need to talk." "There is nothing to talk about," she said, standing up and retreating to the table to tear strips of cloth. "The barn is gone. The hay is gone. You have no way to pay Higgins now." "I will find a way," Silas said. "I will sell the saddle. I will sell the bay." "And if it is not enough?" she asked, her back to him. "If he comes with the sheriff, will you fight them, Silas? Or will you cut your losses? I would never let them take you." He swore. Ilara turned, her eyes wet. "You might not have a choice. And I cannot live waiting for the day you decide I am too expensive to keep." She finished bandaging his hands in silence. The intimacy of the moment before was gone. replaced by the cold reality of their ruin. The night stretched on, endless and cruel. Silas lay in his bed, the pain in his head throbbing in time with his heart. He listened to Alara's breathing across the room. It was ragged, uneven. She was awake. He wanted to cross the floor. He wanted to crawl into her narrow bed and wrap his arms around her and tell her that she was the only thing on this earth that mattered. But he was paralyzed by his own failures. He had failed to protect the herd. He had failed to protect her name. He had failed to be honest. He felt he had lost the right to touch her. Alara lay staring at the ceiling. The smell of smoke was still in her hair. She felt trapped. The fire had been a message from the town. You are not welcome. The letter was a message from the world. You are property. She felt the walls of the cabin closing in. She felt the heavy weight of Silas's debt like a chain around her ankle. She couldn't do it. She couldn't wait to be sold. She couldn't wait to be discarded. Slowly, silently, she sat up. She swung her legs out of bed. She picked up her boots. She did not put them on. She didn't want the sound of footsteps on the floorboards to wake him. She walked to the door, opening it with agonizing slowness. The latch clicked softly. She stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit her like a physical slap, stealing the breath from her lungs. She stepped down into the snow. She was barefoot. The ice burned the soles of her feet, a sharp, clarifying pain. She walked 10 paces away from the cabin, standing under the vast, star-cluttered sky. The ruins of the barn were a smoldering black scar on the white snow. The smell of wet ash was heavy in the air. She looked up at the stars. Cold, indifferent, beautiful. She wrapped her arms around herself, digging her fingers into her ribs. She was huge. She was strong. She had held up a burning roof. I am not merchandise, she whispered to the wind. She looked back at the cabin, at the window where Silas lay. A tear froze on her cheek. I will not be owned, she hissed, her voice gaining strength. I will not be a bargain. I will not be collateral. She shivered violently, her feet numb in the snow. If he cannot see me, if he cannot keep me safe, then I will go. She looked toward the mountains, toward the wild, empty country where no one knew her name. I will walk until my feet bleed, she promised herself. But I will never let a man sign a paper for my life again. She stood there for a long moment, a giantess in the white silence, deciding whether to go back inside to the warmth of the man she was falling in love with, or to walk into the freeze and be free. Slowly, shivering, she turned back to the cabin, not because she was weak, but because she wasn't done yet. She would give him one more chance, but only one. She slipped back inside, the door latch clicking shut like the closing of a book. March arrived not with a trumpet blast of spring, but with the sullen, muddy drag of a winter that refused to die. The snow retreated in patches, leaving behind ground that was a sucking mire of brown sludge. The air remained raw, freezing at night and thawing just enough by noon to soak a man's boots through to the socks. The Vance Ranch was a scar on the landscape. The blackened footprint of the barn stood like a missing tooth in a jawbone. The smell of wet char lingered in the air, reviving every time the damp wind blew from the north. Silas Vance walked the perimeter of the corral, his boots heavy with mud. The herd was decimated. Between the blizzard in February and the fire, he had fewer than 30 head left. They were gaunt, their coats rough and matted, standing hock-deep in the muck, chewing on the meager hay he had managed to salvage. Yet, in the corner of the small pen they had hastily reinforced, a calf stood. It had been born in the chaos of the fire's aftermath, dropped into the snow by a terrified heifer. By all rights, it should have frozen. By all rights, the coyotes should have dragged it off, but it stood there now, a white-faced Hereford with wobbly legs and a stubborn will to live, nursing aggressively. Silas leaned on the rail, watching the calf butt its head against its mother's flank. It was a small thing, a fragile thing, but it was alive. He felt a presence beside him. He did not need to turn to know it was Alara. She moved with a quiet heaviness that he had come to recognize by the vibration in the ground. He is strong, she said. Her voice was rough from the morning cold. He is a fighter, Silas agreed. Like his mother. Ilara rested her arms on the top rail. She wore a man's canvas coat that Silas had traded for in town, the only thing he could find that fit her shoulders, and her hair was tied back with a strip of leather. She looked out at the ruins of the barn. "We need a shelter," she said. "The spring rains will come soon. If they stay out in the wet, the rot will take their hooves." "I know," Silas said. He rubbed his face, feeling the grit of stubble. "But we have no lumber, and no money to buy it. I saw cottonwoods down by the creek," she said, "fallen ones. And there are beams in the burn pile that are only charred on the outside. We can scrape them." Silas looked at her. Her face was set in that determined line he was beginning to know well. She was not asking for permission. She was stating a plan. "It will be hard work," he said. "I am not afraid of work." "Silas," before he could argue. The sound of a wagon rattling over the hard-packed mud of the road drew their attention. A buckboard was coming up the track, pulled by two sturdy mules. The driver was a figure wrapped in a buffalo coat, wearing a hat that had seen better decades. It was Widow Gable. Martha Gable ran the spread to the east. She was 60 years old, buried 2 husbands, and was rumored to have shot a rustler from 300 yards away with a Sharps rifle. She pulled the mules to a halt and spat a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "Morning, Silas," she called out. Her voice sounded like gravel grinding in a churn. "Morning." "Martha," Silas said, stepping away from the fence. Martha's sharp blue eyes shifted to Ilara. She looked the younger woman up and down, not with the sneer of the townspeople, but with the appraising eye of a horse trader. "So this is her," Martha said. "The one Harlan Boyd won't shut his mouth about." "I am Ilara," she said, standing tall. Martha nodded. "You are a big one. Good. This country eats the small ones." She gestured with her thumb to the bed of her wagon. It was loaded with rough-sawn planks and several heavy posts. "I had this timber sitting in my shed," Martha said. "It is taking up space. My hired hand is too lazy to move it, and I am too old. Figured you might have a use for it, seeing as your barn decided to become a bonfire." Silas stared at the wood. It was easily $50 worth of lumber. "Martha, I cannot pay you," Silas said, his pride stiffening his spine. "Did I ask for payment?" she snapped. "I said it is taking up space. You take it. You are doing me a favor. Besides, I need someone to come over and shoe my mare next week. You still know how to swing a hammer, don't you?" Silas swallowed the lump in his throat. "I do. Then we are square. Get this wood out of my wagon. I have coffee to drink. For the next 2 weeks, they did not try to recreate the great barn that had burned. They built a low, 3-sided shelter, a pole barn backed against the wind, sturdy and functional. It was brutal labor. The ground was half frozen, resisting the spade. The logs were heavy and slick with melting ice, but they worked with a rhythm that had become almost telepathic. Silas saw a side of Ilara that went beyond simple strength. He saw her leverage. She knew exactly where to place a fulcrum to move a rock he couldn't budge. She knew how to notch a log so it locked tight. One afternoon, they were hoisting the main crossbeam. It was a massive timber, scavenged from a fallen cottonwood, green and heavy with sap. Silas struggled with his end, his boots slipping in the mud, his bad shoulders screaming in protest. "Wait," Ilara commanded. She moved to the center of the beam. She squatted low, getting her shoulder under the wood. With a sharp exhale, she drove her legs upward. The beam rose. She held the weight of 500 pounds across her back, her face flushed, her teeth gritted. "Set your end." "Silas!" she gasped. He scrambled to guide the timber into the notch. He hammered the peg home. Now the other. She walked the beam up, her boots sinking inches into the mud, until the other end slotted into place. She stepped away, rolling her shoulders, her breath coming in white clouds. Silas stared at her. He was sweating despite the cold, his chest heaving. "God in heaven," he whispered, "you are a wonder." "Ilara." She wiped her forehead with the back of her glove, leaving a smear of dirt. She looked at him, and for the first time in months, a genuine smile broke through her guard. It transformed her face, softening the sharp angles, lighting up her dark eyes. And you, Silas, are staring again. He laughed. It was a rusty sound, surprising him. I suppose I am. The work brought them close in ways the cabin never did. Here, under the open sky, the boundaries of the room didn't exist. They passed hammers back and forth, their fingers brushing. When he slipped on a patch of ice, she caught him by the arm, her grip iron firm, pulling him upright against her chest. For a moment, he was pressed against her, the solid warmth of her breasts, the smell of her sweat and the pine pitch on her coat. He looked up into her face, breathless. She didn't let go immediately. Her eyes searched his, wide and startled. "Careful," she said softly. "I am trying," he murmured. The tension that had been a wall between them began to thin, turning into a charged current. They began to talk, not just about the work, but about small things, the shape of a cloud, the track of a fox. She teased him. It happened on a Tuesday, when he was explaining, at great length, the proper way to oil a hinge. "Silas," she interrupted, a glint in her eye. "You talk like you are paying for the words by the syllable. You treat every sentence like it is the last one you will ever get to say." Silas paused, the oil can in his hand. He looked at her, blinking. "I just like to be precise." "Precise?" She chuckled. A low, rich sound. "You are not precise. You are slow. By the time you finish saying good morning, it is afternoon." He grinned. "Well, Mrs. Vance, some things are worth taking time over." She looked away, hiding a smile, but the color rose in her cheeks. The shelter was finished on a Friday evening. The sun was setting, painting the western horizon in bands of bruised purple and burning gold. The air was still, the wind taking a rare breath. They sat on the porch of the cabin, too tired to move, their muscles humming with the pleasant ache of accomplishment. Silas brought out 2 tin cups of coffee and a bottle of whiskey he had been saving for a year. "Medical supplies," he joked, pouring a generous splash into her cup. "For the aches." Alara took the cup. She wrapped both hands around it, letting the steam warm her face. "Thank you." They sat in silence for a long time, watching the light fade from the peaks. The world felt vast and indifferent, but here, on this porch, it felt manageable. Silas took a sip of the spiked coffee. The whiskey burned a clean path down his throat. He looked at Alara. The golden light caught the side of her face, highlighting the strong line of her nose and the curve of her lip. He felt the words rising in him, the heavy stones he had carried for years. Harlan was right. "You know," he said quietly, "about the killing." Alara didn't look at him. She stared at the mountains. "Tell me." "It was in Abilene," Silas said. 5 years ago. I was working security for a cattle drive. Harlan's younger brother, Caleb, was there. He was drunk. He cornered a girl in the saloon. A serving girl. She couldn't have been more than 18. Silas gripped his cup. He was hurting her. Caleb had a knife. I tried to talk him down. I told him to let her go. He lunged at her. I drew my gun. He paused, the memory playing out in the flickering film of his mind. I aimed for his shoulder. Silas whispered. I just wanted to stop him. But he spun her around. He used her as a shield just as I pulled the trigger. Alara turned to look at him then. Her eyes were dark pools of sorrow. The bullet went through her and hit him. Silas said. They both died. Caleb died instantly. The girl, she took a long time. I held her while she bled out on the sawdust floor. She asked me why I did it. Silas's voice cracked. I have never forgotten that. The weight of that gun in my hand. The way it felt to end a life I was trying to save. That is why I came here. That is why I live alone. I am terrified of what my hands can do when I am angry. I am terrified that if I lose control, even for a second, I will break something I cannot fix. He looked at his hands, scarred and calloused. That is why I am careful with you, Alara. It is not because you are different. It is because I am dangerous. Alara set her cup down on the bench. She turned her body toward him. You are not dangerous. Silas, she said firmly. You are wounded. There is a difference." She took a breath, her chest rising under the heavy coat. "The ringmaster," she began, her voice barely a whisper. His name was Mr. Thorne. He didn't just measure me. He owned me. He told me that a freak like me should be grateful for a roof. He said no man would ever want me for a wife, so I had to be useful in other ways. She picked at a splinter on the bench. He would bring men to my wagon after the show. Rich men. They didn't want to sleep with me. They wanted to see. They wanted me to undress. They wanted to touch me to see if my skin was hard like an elephant's. Silas felt a murderous rage boil in his gut, hot and white. Thorne told me if I didn't smile, if I didn't let them look, he would sell me to a brothel in New Orleans that specialized in oddities. He said they would chain me to a bed, so I let them look. I let them whisper filthy things in my ears. I stood there like a statue while they touched my arms and my legs. She looked up at Silas, tears standing in her eyes. "I am a virgin, Silas, but not because I am pure, because I fought, because every time a man reached for me, I saw Thorne's face, I saw the cage, I learned that being touched means being used. It means being meat." She trembled, a tear spilling over. "That is why I pull away. Not because I do not want you, but because my body remembers the fear, even when my heart does not." Silas reached out. He moved slowly, telegraphing every inch of his intent. He laid his hand on her cheek. His palm was rough, warm, and trembling slightly. Elara froze, her breath hitching. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the grab, the pinch, the cruelty. But Silas just held her face. He used his thumb to wipe away the tear. "I am not Thorne," he whispered, "and I am not a customer. You are not meat. Elara, you are the fire that kept me warm this winter. You are the strength that held up the roof." She opened her eyes. They were inches apart, the smell of whiskey and coffee and wood smoke wrapped around them. He looked at her mouth. The desire that had been simmering all winter surged up, undeniable and heavy. He wanted to kiss her. He wanted to pull her into him and never let go, but he stopped. "I will not take." "Elara," he said, his voice husky, "I will never take. If you want this, if you want me, you have to tell me. I will not touch you past this point unless you ask." Elara looked at him. She saw the restraint in his jaw. She saw the love in his eyes, not pity, not fascination, but love. She was terrified. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. But beneath the fear, there was a hunger she had denied for a lifetime, a hunger to be known, to be held. "Silas," she whispered. She leaned forward. It was a movement of inches, but it felt like crossing a canyon. "Kiss me," she said. He closed the distance. It was not a smooth kiss. It was hesitant, clumsy with nerves. Their noses bumped. His stubble grazed her chin. But when their lips met, the world fell away. His mouth was warm and firm. Elara made a small sound in her throat, half sob, half sigh. She reached up and gripped his coat, pulling him closer. Silas groaned low in his chest, his hand sliding into her hair, cupping the back of her head. The kiss deepened. It became desperate. It tasted of whiskey and salt tears. It was the taste of two starving people finally finding bread. For a moment, Elara forgot she was a giantess. She forgot the show. She forgot the shame. She was just a woman, and she was wanted. Then, the intensity spiked. Silas shifted, his body pressing harder against hers, his hand moving down to her waist. Panic flared in Elara's chest. The old reflex kicked in. "Too close, too fast, trap." She jerked back, breaking the kiss with a gasp. She shoved against his chest, her strength sending him rocking back on the bench. "No!" she cried out, her eyes wide and wild. Silas froze, his hands held up in surrender. "Elara, I stopped. I am here. It is okay." Elara stood up, knocking over her coffee cup. The tin clattered loudly on the wood. She was trembling violently, hugging herself. "I can't," she stammered. "I can't. It is too much. I'm sorry." She turned and fled into the cabin, the door slamming shut behind her. Silas sat on the porch, his heart pounding, his lips still tingling from the kiss. He buried his face in his hands. He had tasted heaven, and now he was back in the cold. 3 days later, the devil came to collect. The morning was bright and deceptive. The mud was drying into hard ruts. Silas was in the corral, checking the hoof of the surviving calf. When the riders appeared, there were 4 of them. Harlan Boyd rode in front, sitting on a massive black stallion. Behind him was the sheriff, looking unhappy, and 2 men in suits who looked like they belonged in a bank, not a barnyard. Silas dropped the calf's leg and walked to the gate. He wiped his hands on his pants, his face hardening into stone. Ilara came out of the cabin. She stood on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She saw Harlan and went still. "Morning. Vance," Harlan called out. He didn't smile. This was business. "What do you want?" "Harlan," Silas asked. "I'm here to facilitate a transaction," Harlan said. He gestured to the men in suits. "This is Mr. Thorne, no relation to your wife's old friend. I assume from the Laramie Bank. And this is his associate." The man named Thorne stepped down from his horse. He held a sheaf of papers. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice dry as dust. "We hold the note on your mortgage. We also purchased the outstanding debt from a Mr. Higgins in Chicago regarding a personal loan." Silas felt the blood drain from his head. "You bought the note?" "We did," the banker said. "And as of this morning, you are in default. The total arrears, including the Higgins debt and the interest, is $340. I have until spring to pay the mortgage," Silas argued. "The terms allow for immediate recall if the collateral is deemed at risk," the banker said, glancing at the burnt remains of the barn. "The fire depreciated the value of the property significantly." "We are foreclosing." Silas looked at the sheriff. "John, is this legal?" The sheriff looked at the ground. "They have the paper." "Silas, I checked it. It is tight." Harlan chuckled. He leaned forward on his saddle horn. "Now, there is an alternative." Silas looked at him. "What alternative?" "I am a generous man." "Silas, I hate to see a neighbor thrown out in the snow. I am willing to cover the debt. I will pay the bank. I will even pay off the broker." "And in exchange?" Silas asked, his voice low. "In exchange, I take the land," Harlan said. "You can stay on as a tenant. You can work the herd, but the deed comes to me." Silas's jaw tightened. "And what else?" Harlan's eyes flicked to the porch. "To Ilara. And her," he said. Ilara stepped off the porch. She walked toward the gate, her stride long and angry. "What did you say?" she demanded. Harlan smiled. "A wet, ugly thing. I need a housekeeper. Darlin', my place is big, lots of heavy lifting. You can work off the interest. You come live at my ranch. You cook, you clean, you entertain." Silas moved. He reached for the pistol at his hip. "Don't!" the sheriff barked, leveling his shotgun. "Don't do it! Silas, there are 4 of us." Silas froze, his hand hovering. He was shaking with rage. "You son of a bitch! It is a business offer." "Vance," Harlan said, "take it or leave it. If you refuse, the bank takes the land today. You are out, both of you, with nothing but the clothes on your backs." Ilara walked up to the fence. She looked Harlan in the eye. She was taller than him, even with him on the horse. "I would rather freeze in a ditch," she said, her voice clear and cold as ice. Harlan's smile vanished. "Have it your way, freak." He turned to the banker. "Serve the papers." The banker stepped forward and thrust the document at Silas. "You have 24 hours to vacate, Mr. Vance, or pay the full amount." They turned their horses and rode away. Harlan looked back once, his eyes promising retribution. The silence they left behind was deafening. Silas stood holding the paper. $340. It might as well have been $1 million. He looked at Ilara. She was staring at the retreating riders, her face pale. "He wants to separate us," she whispered. "He wants to own me. He will never have you." Silas vowed, "I will burn this ranch to the ground before I let him touch you. But we have no money." "Silas!" She turned to him, panic rising in her voice. "We have nothing." "I have the saddle," Silas said frantically. "I have the rifle. I have the team." "It is not enough." "I will go to town," Silas said. "I will talk to the mayor. I will talk to the other ranchers. Martha Gable might lend me the money. Martha doesn't have that kind of cash." Ilara said, "I have to try," Silas yelled. He was desperate. He ran to the corral and began to saddle the bay. Ilara watched him. She felt a cold resolve settling in her gut. He was going to beg. He was going to debase himself, and it wouldn't work. Harlan had the town in his pocket. She looked at the sky. To the west, over the mountains, a wall of darkness was building. Clouds the color of bruised iron were piling up, blotting out the sun. The wind was picking up, carrying the scent of ozone and ice. A spring blizzard. The Widowmaker. "Silas, look at the sky," she said. "A storm is coming. I can make it to town and back before it hits," Silas said, cinching the girth tight. "It is suicide. It is our only chance." Silas swung into the saddle. He looked down at her. His eyes were wild, desperate. "I will be back, Ilara. I promise. I will fix this." He spurred the horse and galloped out of the yard, mud flying from the hooves. Ilara stood alone in the yard. She watched him disappear over the rise. She looked at the looming storm. The temperature was dropping fast. The wind whipped her hair across her face. She felt the dread uncoil in her stomach, heavy and cold. He wasn't coming back with money. He was riding into a trap. Harlan wouldn't let him just walk into town and find a savior. She looked at the empty horizon. She looked at the paper Silas had dropped in the mud. Old habits whispered in her ear. "You are the problem. You are the burden. If you weren't here, he wouldn't be in this debt." She began to pace the yard, the wind tearing at her coat. The first flakes of snow began to fall, swirling in the gray air. Something terrible was about to break. She could feel it in her bones, deeper than the cold. She wrapped her arms around herself, staring into the gathering dark, waiting for the first blow. The storm did not arrive like a weather system. It arrived like a judgment. At 2 p.m, the sky turned the color of a bruised plum, heavy and suffocating. By 3, the wind began to scream, a high, thin shriek that vibrated in the teeth. By 4, the world was gone. The blizzard erased the landscape, the corral fence, the ruins of the barn, the distant line of cottonwoods. All of it vanished behind a curtain of driving white that moved horizontally, slashing at the cabin walls like buckshot. The temperature dropped so fast the logs of the cabin popped and groaned, shrinking in the sudden freeze. Ilara paced the length of the small room. 4 steps one way, 4 steps back. She stopped at the window, scraping a circle in the frost that had already formed on the inside of the glass. She saw nothing but a swirling gray void. Silas had been gone for 6 hours. He should have been back. The ride to town was 2 hours in good weather. Even if he had stayed to plead with the mayor, even if he had stopped to warm his hands at the livery, he should have been back before the whiteout hit. Anxiety was a cold stone in her stomach. She fed the stove, the wood clattering loudly in the silence. She imagined him on the road. She imagined the bay horse stumbling in a drift. She imagined Harlan Boyd's smile. The light faded from gray to a suffocating black. The wind howled down the chimney, blowing smoke back into the room. "He is not coming," the voice in her head whispered. The voice sounded like the ringmaster. "He has left you, or he is dead." Ilara grabbed her coat. It was the heavy canvas one Silas had traded for, smelling of him and tobacco. She pulled it on, buttoning it to her chin. She wrapped a thick wool scarf around her head, covering her ears and nose. She shoved her hands into leather gloves. She did not think about the danger. She did not think about the fact that men died 10 feet from their doors in storms like this. She only thought of the silence where his heartbeat should be. She lit the hurricane lantern, shielding the flame inside her coat, and pushed the door open. The wind hit her like a physical blow, staggering her backward. She lowered her shoulder and pushed out, fighting the door shut behind her. The cold was absolute. It seared the exposed skin around her eyes instantly. She felt her way to the shelter they had built. The mules were huddled in the corner, miserable. The old plow horse, a massive gray mare named Bessie, turned her head. Ilara grabbed the saddle. It was heavy, stiff with cold, but she threw it onto Bessie's back with a grunt of effort. She didn't bother with the bit. She used a hackamore. knowing the metal would tear the horse's mouth in this freeze. She mounted, the wood of the shelter creaking under the combined weight. She turned the mare into the wind. "Find him! Bessie!" she shouted, the words torn away by the gale. They moved into the white. The road was a memory. Elara guided the horse by instinct and the faint, treacherous outlines of the fence posts that poked up through the drifting snow. The wind tried to push them off the track, shoving against Elara's broad side like a giant hand. She leaned into it, using her size as ballast. They rode for an hour. It felt like 10. Elara's eyelashes froze together. Her hands were numb blocks of wood. Then, Bessie shied, nearly unseating her. Elara peered down. A fence post was shattered. The wire snapped and coiling in the wind like a snake. Beside it, half buried in a drift, lay a dark shape. A hat. Elara slid from the saddle, sinking to her waist in the snow. She fought her way to the object. It was Silas's hat. The brim was crushed. She looked at the snow around the broken post. The wind was covering it fast, but there was a smear of darkness that was not dirt. It was red, bright, frozen red. Panic exploded in her chest. She scrambled back to the horse, hauling herself up. "Silas!" she screamed. The wind swallowed his name. She kicked the mare forward, forcing the animal through a chest-high drift. They reached the creek crossing. The water was frozen, a jagged scar of ice. On the far bank, a mound of white was motionless. A horse. Elara drove Bessie across the ice. The bay gelding was down, its leg twisted at a sickening angle. It was dead, its body already stiffening, and beside it, huddled in the lee of the dead animal's flank, was a smaller mound. Elara threw herself off the mare. She fell into the snow and crawled the last few feet. She dug frantically with her hands, tossing scoop after scoop of white powder aside until she found wool. Silas. He was curled into a ball, his arms wrapped around his head. He was covered in snow, his coat stiff with ice. Elara grabbed his shoulder and rolled him over. His face was a mask of blood and blue bruises. His eyes were closed. His lips were blue. "Silas." She slapped his cheek. Hard. "Wake up." He groaned. It was a weak, pitiful sound, but it was the best sound she had ever heard. She didn't waste time checking for broken bones. If she left him here to check, he would die. She grabbed him under the arms. He was dead weight, limp and heavy. She planted her feet in the shifting snow. She roared, a sound of pure defiance against the storm, and lifted him. She dragged him toward Bessie. The plow horse danced nervously, eyeing the body. "Stand," Elara commanded, her voice cracking. She hefted Silas up. It took everything she had. Her back screamed, her muscles burning, but she shoved him over the saddle, balancing him on his stomach like a sack of grain. She scrambled up behind him, grabbing his coat to keep him from sliding off. "Go home, Bessie!" The ride back was a blur of terror. Elara held Silas against her, trying to share her warmth, but he was like a block of ice. He murmured unintelligible things, his head lolling against her shoulder. The wind struck them from all sides, blinding and disorienting. Elara buried her face in his back, trusting the horse, trusting the instinct that pulled them toward shelter. When the cabin loomed out of the dark, Elara began to weep. She slid off the horse and pulled Silas down into her arms. She kicked the door, shouting until the latch gave way. She dragged him inside and slammed the door. Throwing the bolt, the silence of the room was shocking. Elara dropped to her knees. She pulled Silas toward the stove. "Silas, can you hear me?" He didn't answer. She began to strip him. Her fingers were clumsy with cold, fumbling with the buttons. She used a knife to cut his laces, pulling off his frozen boots. His feet were white as marble. She stripped him down to his long underwear, which was soaked with sweat and melted snow. She dragged the mattress from her bed close to the fire and rolled him onto it. She piled every blanket they owned on top of him. She heated bricks on the stove, wrapping them in towels and tucking them around his body. She boiled water. She washed the blood from his face. He had a deep gash on his forehead. His ribs were mottled with dark bruising, the shape of a boot heel. "Harlan," she hissed, the name a curse. Silas began to thrash. The heat was hitting him, waking the nerves. "No, stay down," he mumbled. "Silas, it is me. It is Alara. They are coming. The flank. Watch the flank. He was back in the war, or maybe back in the ambush. I am sorry," he whispered, his voice broken and high. "I lost it. The money. I lost it." Alara stroked his hair, her hand trembling. "You are safe." "You are home. I am poison," he gasped, his eyes flying open, unseeing. "Everything I touch dies. The girl, the ranch. Alara, I am here. Silas, I am not dead." He looked at her then, his eyes focused slowly. He saw the soot on her face, the fear in her eyes. He saw the roof of the cabin. "Alara," he croaked, "I am here." He tried to sit up, but groaned and fell back. "My head? You were beaten," she said, dipping a cloth in warm water and pressing it to his brow. "Harlan's men?" Silas closed his eyes. "They were waiting, by the creek. 4 of them. Said the payment was due." Alara's hand stilled. She looked at his battered face. He had ridden into a trap for her. He had taken the beating that was meant for her spirit. The wind outside battered the walls, piling snow against the window until the glass was completely covered. They were entombed. No sheriff was coming, no neighbor. They were alone in the white universe. Silas reached out a shaking hand and touched her arm. "I didn't get the money. Alara, I failed. You are alive," she said fiercely. "That is all that matters." He looked at her, really looked at her, with a clarity that cut through the pain. "You rode out. In this, I came to get you. You could have died. You should have run. Why didn't you run?" "Because you are my husband," she said, "and I was tired of running." Silas let out a long, ragged breath. He closed his eyes, tears leaking from the corners. "I'm sorry. Alara, I brought this to your door. I brought the bully. I brought the debt. I am a curse." "Stop it," she said. "I am," he insisted. "I kill what I love. I am a killer. Alara." Harlan was right. "No," she leaned over him, gripping his shoulders. "Harlan is a liar. You are not a killer. You are the man who gave me a home. You are the man who stood between me and the town." She took a breath, her voice lowering. "You want to know what I see? I see the only man who ever looked at me and didn't see a ticket sales number. I see the man who saved a calf in a blizzard. I see the strongest, bravest soul I have ever known." Silas stared up at her. The firelight cast shadows across her face, making her look like a giantess from a myth, powerful and ancient. "You saved me," he whispered. "Tonight, and every day since you came, you saved me from the silence." He reached for her hand, his fingers wrapped around hers, weak but desperate. "I thought of you," he said. "When I was lying in the snow, I thought I will never tell her." "Tell me what?" Alara asked, her heart hammering. "That I want you," he said. The words hung in the warm air. "Not to work, not to cook. I want you." Alara felt a flush rise from her neck. She pulled her hand back slightly, but he held on. "I have wanted you since the first night," Silas confessed, his voice growing stronger with the fever of truth. "Every time you walk across the room, every time you lift a bale of hay, I watch you. And I hate myself for it because I promised I wouldn't be like them." "You are not like them," she whispered. "I kept my distance." He said, "I slept on the floor. I looked away because I didn't want you to feel trapped. I didn't want you to think you had to pay for your keep." Alara began to cry, silent tears tracking through the dust on her face. "You think I didn't want you?" she asked. "Silas, I laid in that bed every night wishing you would cross the room, but I was scared. I am still scared." She choked on a sob. "I don't know how. Silas, I don't know how to be touched without shrinking. I don't know how to be soft. I am too big. I am too clumsy." Silas shifted, wincing as his ribs protested. He pulled on her hand, drawing her down. "You are not too big," he said. "You are perfect. You are the mountains. You are the sky. You are everything." He brought her hand to his lips, kissing the rough knuckles, the palm, the wrist. "I will never take more than you give." Elara, I swear it. The desire in the room was a physical weight. It mixed with the smell of the storm and the wood smoke. It was heavy with months of denial, heavy with the terror of near death. Elara looked at him. She saw the bruising on his face, the vulnerability in his eyes. He wasn't a master. He wasn't a ringmaster. He was just a man, hurt and lonely, who loved her. She slowly lowered herself onto the edge of the mattress. She reached out and touched his chest, feeling the beat of his heart under the bandages. "Show me," she whispered. Silas let out a sound that was half groan, half prayer. He reached for her. He pulled her down until she was lying beside him, the blankets covering them both. The heat of their bodies mingled. He ran his hands down the length of her back, over the curve of her hip. He didn't measure her. He didn't weigh her. He worshipped her. Elara trembled. Her muscles locked up, expecting the pain, expecting the mockery. Silas felt it. He stopped. He brought his face close to hers, his forehead resting against hers. "Breathe," he whispered. "Just breathe with me." He kissed her, softly at first, then with a hunger that shattered his control. Elara kissed him back, opening her mouth, tasting him. She pressed her body against his, feeling the hardness of him, the reality of his desire. It wasn't fear she felt now. It was a fire that started in her belly and spread to her fingertips. She wanted him closer. She wanted to erase the space between them. Silas was lost in her. The fever, the adrenaline, and the sheer overwhelming relief of being alive collided in his brain. He needed her. He needed to be anchored to the earth by her. His hands moved urgently, fumbling with the layers of her clothes. He was shaking. He felt like he was drowning. "Elara, please," he gasped against her neck. He tried to position himself, but his ribs screamed in pain. He couldn't move the way he wanted. He needed her to help him. He needed her to take control, but the words wouldn't form properly. His mind was a haze of sensory overload. He gripped her hips, his fingers digging into the flesh. He looked up at her, his eyes wild and dark, stripped of all pretense. "Spread your legs fast," he blurted out. The words cracked in the air like a whip, crude, commanding, jarringly unromantic. Silas froze. His eyes went wide with instant horror. He flushed a deep, burning crimson that was visible even in the lantern light. He looked like a boy who had just dropped a communion plate. "I didn't mean," he stammered, horrified. "I meant, please. He tried to back away, shame flooding his face. Elara stared at him for a second, stunned. The line was something a customer would say, something Harlan would say, but the way he said it, hoarse, desperate, with his voice cracking on the last word. It wasn't a command. It was a plea. It was the clumsy, unguarded noise of a man who had forgotten how to speak because he wanted her so much his brain had short-circuited. A bubble of laughter rose in her chest. It wasn't hysterical. It was genuine. It broke the tension like a hammer on glass. She laughed, a deep, resonant sound that shook her chest. Silas looked at her, miserable. "I am sorry. I am a coarse idiot. I ruined it. You're an idiot," she agreed, smiling through her tears. "But you are my idiot." She leaned over him, her hair creating a curtain around them. She kissed his nose, then his mouth. "You don't have to order me." "Silas," she whispered against his lips. "You just have to ask." She shifted her weight. She moved with a grace that belied her size, careful of his ribs, careful of his wounds. She took his hands and placed them on her waist. "Like this?" she asked softly. Silas let out a shuddering breath. "Yes, God, yes." She lowered herself onto him. It was not a conquest. It was a surrender. For the first time in her life, Elara was not being taken. She was giving. She felt the incredible, stretching fullness of him, and the shock of it made her gasp. Silas watched her face. He saw the wince, and he stopped, his hands soothing her. "All right?" he whispered. Elara looked down at him. She saw the awe in his face. She felt the connection. deep and rooting. The shame that had wrapped her body like a shroud for 24 years began to tear. "Yes," she said. They moved together. It was a slow, rhythmic rocking, dictated by pain and tenderness. It was the sound of breath catching, of skin sliding against skin, of whispered names. "Oh, Ilara." Silas groaned, arching his back, forgetting his ribs, forgetting the snow, forgetting the debt. She held him. She held him against the storm. She felt his release, the way he shook apart in her arms. And a moment later, she followed him, a wave of heat and light that washed away the traveling show, the cage, and the name freak. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the mound of blankets. The fire in the stove had burned down to red coals. The wind still shrieked outside, burying the world. But inside, the cabin was a fortress. Silas lay with his head on her chest, his breathing deepening into sleep. Ilara ran her fingers through his hair. She traced the line of his spine. She felt changed. The hollowness was filled. The cage door was open. Silas shifted, mumbling into her skin. "What?" she whispered. "I love you," he murmured, half asleep. Ilara closed her eyes. She listened to the storm. It had come to destroy them. It had tried to kill him and freeze her, but instead, it had stripped them bare and welded them together. "I love you too, Silas," she whispered into the dark. She pulled the quilt higher around his shoulders. Outside, the snow fell, erasing the road to town, erasing the tracks of the bully, leaving a clean, white page for the morning. The morning broke with a silence so profound it felt heavy, as if the sky itself were pressing down on the roof. The storm had exhausted itself in the night, leaving behind a world scoured clean and buried deep. The light that filtered through the frost-thickened windows was a pale, spectral blue, the color of cold that could snap iron. Silas Vance opened his eyes. For a moment, he did not know where he was. His body felt like a landscape of pain. His ribs were a throbbing cage of bruises. His head ached with a dull, rhythmic thud, and his hands burned where the frost had kissed them. But there was a warmth beside him that anchored him to the earth. He turned his head. Ilara was asleep. She lay on her side. Her dark hair spilled across the pillow they now shared. In the gray light, the tension that usually held her face in a mask of defense was gone. She looked younger. She looked peaceful. Her large hand rested on the quilt near his chest. The fingers relaxed. Silas watched her, his breath catching in his throat. The memory of the night before rushed back, not as a fever dream, but as a vivid, visceral reality. The storm, the rescue, the clumsy, desperate words he had blurted out, the way she had laughed, the way she had welcomed him. He felt a sudden, sharp fear. Daylight had a way of stealing the courage of the night. He worried she would wake up and remember she was a giantess and he was a broken soldier, and the walls would go back up. Then, Ilara shifted. Her eyelids fluttered open. She looked at him. There was a second of hesitation, a flicker of the old uncertainty. But then she saw the way he was looking at her, with raw, undisguised worship. "Morning," she whispered. Her voice was husky with sleep. "Morning," Silas rasped. He tried to shift his weight to face her more fully, but his ribs protested with a sharp stab of agony. He gasped, his face paling. Ilara was awake instantly. She sat up, the quilt falling to her waist. She did not grab for it to cover herself. She reached for him. "Careful," she said, her hands gentle on his shoulders. "You are battered black and blue." "Silas, I am alive," he said, gritting his teeth against the pain. "Thanks to you." He reached up and took her hand, pressing it to his cheek. "It is not a dream, then?" Ilara smiled, a soft, private thing. "No, it is not a dream." The intimacy of the moment was terrifying in its fragility. They were two people who had spent a lifetime building fortresses around their hearts, and now the gates were open. It felt dangerous. It felt essential. "We have to check the stock," Silas said, forcing himself to sit up. "The snow, the shelter might have collapsed." Ilara frowned. "You should rest. I can go." "We go together," Silas said firmly, I am done leaving you behind to handle the heavy lifting. Ilara, we do it together." She looked at him, searching his face for any sign of regret. She found none. She nodded. Together. Getting out of the cabin was a battle. The snow had drifted halfway up the door. They had to push together. Silas leaning his good shoulder against the wood. Ilara using her immense strength to shove the drift back. When they finally stumbled out onto the porch, the world was blinding. The sun was just cresting the eastern ridges, turning the endless white ocean of snow into a field of diamonds. The sky was a hard, flawless azure. The fences were gone, mere ripples in the snow. The ruins of the old barn were a white mound, but the pole shelter still stood. They waded through the waist-deep snow, breaking a trail for each other. When they reached the shelter, Bessie the mare nickered at them. The calf was tucked into the straw, warm and dry. The mules were grumpy but alive. They worked in tandem to clear the entrance and toss hay to the animals. There was no need for orders. When Silas reached for a shovel, Ilara was already there to take the heavy load. When she struggled with a frozen latch, his knife was there to pry it loose. They moved like two parts of the same engine, synchronized by the memory of each other's skin. By noon, the road to town was still impassable for a wagon, but a rider could make it. They were finishing a meal of coffee and corn mush when they saw a horse struggling up the track. It was a massive plow horse, plowing through the drifts, carrying a figure wrapped in enough wool to clothe an army. Martha Gable. She rode into the yard and slid off her horse, landing with a grunt. She looked at the cabin, then at Silas, who was standing on the porch with his arm bandaged and his face bruised. "You look like you went 12 rounds with a thresher and lost," Martha noted, spitting tobacco juice into a snowbank. "I feel about the same," Silas said. "Coffee. Martha? Black and hot." She said, "Inside." Martha sat at the table, her sharp eyes darting between Silas and Ilara. She saw the way Ilara stood closer to him than before. She saw the way Silas tracked Ilara's movements across the room. Martha suppressed a smile. "I brought news," Martha said, wrapping her gnarled hands around the tin cup. "And some flour. I figured you might be low." "Thank you," Ilara said. "The town is buzzing like a kicked hive." Martha continued. "Harlan Boyd's men didn't come back to the saloon last night until dawn. 2 of them have frostbite bad enough to lose toes. One of them, a fella named Pike, has a broken nose. Says he ran into a tree. He ran into a fence post," Ilara said quietly. Martha nodded. "Figures. But that ain't the worst of it. Harlan is in a rage. He is telling anyone who will listen that you defaulted. Silas, he says the sheriff is coming to evict you as soon as the snow melts." Silas stiffened. "He can try." "And," Martha added, looking directly at Ilara, "he is saying things, vile things. He is boasting that he broke Silas Vance. And he is telling folks that he is going to take you in, like a stray dog. He says you will be scrubbing his floors by Sunday." Ilara's hands clenched into fists at her sides. The shame tried to rise, the old reflex to hide, but she looked at Silas. He wasn't looking at the floor. He was looking at her, and his eyes were burning with a cold, protective fury. "He is a liar," Silas said. "The town is starting to wonder." Martha said, "They saw the condition of those men. They know you are just one man. Silas, they are starting to ask how 4 hired guns got bested by a rancher in a storm. They are starting to ask if Harlan pushed too far." Silas stood up. He walked to the wall and took down his gun belt. He strapped it on, wincing as the leather cinched over his bruised ribs. "We are going to town," he said. "Now?" Martha asked. "The roads are hell. Now!" Silas said. "I am done hiding. I am done letting him tell the story." Ilara stepped forward. "I am coming with you." Silas turned to her. "I expected nothing less." They rode into Ironwood 3 hours later. The town was digging itself out. Men were shoveling boardwalks, shopkeepers were chipping ice from storefronts. The sound of shovels scraping against wood stopped as the Vances appeared. It was a sight the town would talk about for a generation. Silas rode the gray mare, Bessie, because the bay was dead. He sat stiffly, his face a map of violence, his hat pulled low. But beside him, riding one of the mules because no other horse could carry her easily, was Alara. She sat tall. She did not hunch. She wore her men's coat and a scarf, but her head was high. She looked at the people staring at her, and for the first time, she did not look away. She met their gazes with a solemn, terrifying dignity. They rode straight to the sheriff's office. Harlan Boyd's black stallion was tied out front, along with the horses of the banker and the mayor. Silas dismounted. He swayed slightly when his boots hit the ground, pain radiating up his legs, but he steadied himself. Alara swung down, towering over him, towering over everyone. They walked onto the boardwalk. The door to the office opened, and the sheriff stepped out, followed by Harlan. "Well, look who crawled out of the snow," Harlan sneered. He looked tired, his eyes rimmed with red, but his arrogance was untouched. "I was just telling the sheriff it is time to execute that foreclosure. You are trespassing." "Vance!" Silas stepped up to the edge of the porch. A crowd began to gather. Store clerks, ranchers, women with baskets. They sensed the violence in the air. "I am not trespassing," Silas said, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "I am standing on ground that I paid for with blood and sweat, and I am here to report a crime." Harlan laughed. "A crime? You not paying your debts isn't a crime. It is just pathetic. Attempted murder is a crime," Silas said. The crowd murmured. Harlan's smile faltered. "Your men ambushed me at the creek crossing yesterday," Silas said. "4 of them. They beat me. They killed my horse. They left me to freeze. They told me it was a message from you." "That is a lie," Harlan spat. "You got lost in the storm." "Old man, you fell off your horse." "Is it?" Silas asked. "Then why are your men nursing broken bones? Why did I find them waiting for me?" "Sheriff, arrest him," Harlan commanded. "He is disturbed." The sheriff didn't move. He was looking at Alara. Alara stepped forward. The wood of the boardwalk groaned under her boot. She moved past Silas, placing herself between him and Harlan. She looked down at the bully. She was 6 inches taller than him. "Tell them the rest, Harlan," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it resonated like a cello string. Harlan sneered up at her. "Shut your mouth, freak. No one wants to hear you grunt. Tell them you tried to buy me." She continued, her voice rising. "Tell them you threatened to foreclose on the land unless I agreed to come to your house. Unless I agreed to belong to you." The crowd went silent. The women on the street stopped whispering. She looked out at the townspeople. She saw the baker who had stared at her. She saw the women who had crossed the street to avoid her. "He calls me a monster," Alara said. She spread her arms, the heavy coat hanging open. "Look at me. Yes, I am big. Yes, I am different. I was sold by my father. I was sold to a circus. I was sold to a broker. I have been treated like cattle my entire life." She pointed a long finger at Harlan. "But this man wanted to own me not because I am a monster, but because he is one. He wanted to break my husband. He wanted to humiliate us because we dared to survive without his permission." Harlan's face turned a violent shade of purple. "You lying bitch," he hissed. "He threatened to chain me," Alara said. "He threatened to use me. And when my husband tried to protect me, he had him beaten in the snow." She looked at Harlan with pity. "You are small, Harlan. You are so small that you have to stand on the necks of others to feel tall." The truth hung in the air, undeniable. The townspeople looked at Harlan. They saw the rage in his eyes. They saw the bruises on Silas. They remembered the arrogance, the threats, the years of Harlan pushing his weight around. Harlan saw the tide turning. He saw the disgust in the eyes of his neighbors. Panic flared in his chest. He was losing control. "That is enough," Harlan roared. He reached for his gun. It was a foolish, desperate move. Silas reacted on instinct. His hand blurred. The Colt Navy was in his hand before Harlan had even cleared leather. Silas leveled the gun at Harlan's chest. The hammer clicked back. In that split second, Silas saw the saloon in Abilene. He saw the girl. He saw the blood. The terror of his own lethal hand surged up. He was going to kill him. He had to kill him. "Silas!" Alara's hand clamped onto his forearm. It was heavy and grounding. She didn't push the gun down. She just held him. "Don't," she whispered. "He is not worth the ghost. Silas, don't let him turn you back into a killer." Silas froze. He looked at Harlan, who was staring down the barrel of the gun, sweating, his hand half frozen on his own weapon. Silas looked at Alara. Her eyes were steady. She was his anchor. He let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He didn't lower the gun, but his finger eased off the trigger. "Drop it." "Harlan," Silas said coldly. Harlan, trembling with rage and humiliation, tried to reholster his gun, but his hands were shaking and his boots were slick with snow. He took a step back, his heel catching on a patch of black ice on the boardwalk. He flailed. He fell backward, hard, off the raised porch. He landed in the frozen street right behind his stallion. The black horse, spooked by the sudden movement and the shouting, reared up. Its iron-shod hooves came down. Harlan screamed. The horse's hoof struck Harlan's leg, shattering the bone with a sickening crack. The animal danced away. Wild-eyed, Harlan lay in the muck, clutching his leg, screaming in agony. The sheriff jumped off the porch. "Get the doctor," he yelled. Silas slowly lowered his gun. He looked at Harlan, writhing in the mud. There was no satisfaction in it, only a grim sense of finality. Alara slipped her arm through Silas's. She leaned her weight against him, supporting him. "It is over," she said. The investigation that followed was swift. The sheriff, emboldened by the town's shift in opinion, questioned Harlan's men. Pike, the one with the broken nose, confessed to the ambush in exchange for leniency. He admitted Harlan had ordered them to teach Vance a lesson he wouldn't wake up from. The banker, seeing the way the wind was blowing and fearing a riot, discovered a clerical error in the foreclosure paperwork. The deadline was extended. It was not a fairy tale ending. The town did not suddenly throw a parade for the giant bride. People still stared. Children still whispered. Prejudice is a weed with deep roots. It does not die in a day. But the malice was gone. When Silas went to the general store, men nodded to him. When Alara walked down the street, people stepped aside, not out of fear, but out of a begrudging respect. She had stood up to Harlan Boyd. She had saved her husband. She was formidable. Help came quietly. Martha Gable sent her hired hands to help rebuild the barn properly. A sack of seed corn appeared on their porch. A blacksmith fixed the plow for free. Silas and Alara returned to the ranch. They had their land. They had their scars. And they had the silence of the high plains, which no longer felt empty, but full. Spring came with a rush of water. The snow melted into the creeks, turning them into roaring torrents. The grass exploded in a green so vibrant it hurt the eyes. The ranch came alive. Silas worked the herd, his ribs healed but aching when it rained. He watched the new calves taking their first steps. He watched Alara. She moved through the land with a new confidence. She no longer tried to shrink. She wore dresses she had sewn herself, cut to fit her frame, bright calicos that caught the sun. One afternoon, a calf got stuck in a mud bog near the river. Silas was reaching for his rope, but Alara was already there. She waded into the muck, laughing as the mud sucked at her skirts. She scooped the calf up in her arms, 100 pounds of struggling animal, and hauled it to the bank. She stood there, covered in mud, laughing, the calf bleeding in her arms. Silas watched her, his heart swelling until he thought it might burst. She wasn't a freak. She was a force of nature. Their evenings were quiet. They bathed in a large tin tub by the stove, taking turns washing each other's backs. The shame that Alara had carried about her body had dissolved, washed away by Silas's hands and his reverence. She learned to let him look at her. She learned to look at herself in the small mirror and see a woman who was loved. They read together. Silas would read from a newspaper or the Bible, his voice low and steady. Alara would sit on the rug, Silas's head resting in her lap, her massive fingers gently combing through his hair, untangling the gray from the brown. By late autumn, the signs of the future were undeniable. Alara's dresses were let out at the waist. She moved a little slower. She placed her hand on her stomach often, a look of wonder on her face. A child. A child made not from a transaction, but from love. A child who would grow up knowing that size was not a curse, but a capacity for holding more life. Christmas Eve, 1884. The winter had returned, but it was a gentle one. Snow dusted the ground, but the air was still. Silas and Alara sat on the porch bench, wrapped in a buffalo robe. The sky was a canopy of cold, hard stars, glittering like shattered glass. The land stretched away in blue shadows. "It has been a year," Alara said softly. "Since the storm." Silas nodded. He held her hand, his thumb tracing her knuckles. "A year since I almost died. A year since I found my life." He looked at her. She was beautiful in the starlight. "You know," he said, a mischievous glint in his eye, "I seem to remember saying something very particular to you that night." Alara blushed. Even in the dark, he could see it. "Silas Vance, do not repeat it." "Something about speed?" Silas teased. "And legs?" Alara laughed, the sound bright and free. "You were delirious. You were a babbling fool." "I was," Silas admitted, his smile fading into something tender. "I was a desperate man trying to tell you that I needed you more than I needed air. I just chose the wrong words." Alara leaned her head on his shoulder. "They were the right words," she whispered, "because they were yours, and because for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was being bought. I felt like I was being chosen." Silas kissed the top of her head. "I choose you, Alara. Every day, every morning when the sun comes up, and every night when the wind blows, I choose you." They sat in silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. They were not perfect. They were scarred people. Silas still woke up sweating from dreams of gunfire. Alara still flinched when strangers laughed too loudly. They were odd, the lonely cowboy and his giant bride. But as they sat there, rooted on their land, holding each other against the vast, indifferent dark of the American West, they knew they had won the only victory that mattered. They had survived, and they were not alone. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope the journey of Silas and Alara resonated with you. I would love to hear your thoughts on their story. Please leave a comment below letting me know where you are listening from and what you thought of the ending. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of the frontier. Thank you for your time.